Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Helfrich, and I'm a senior manager on the state policy team at Ceres. I help lead our work in the West and spearhead our multi-state transportation advocacy. So before we hear from Tony and Peg, I wanted to walk through Ceres' partnership with companies on electrifying transportation and provide some context for today's discussion. First, I'm going to hop to the agenda and quickly give you the run of show. So I'm going to cover the corporate support for clean transportation and Ceres' work in this area. And then we'll go to Tony to hear California's zero emission vehicle regulations and market. And then Peg to hear about New Jersey's ambitious transportation decarbonization plans. And then we'll end with a discussion moderated by my colleague, John, between Tony and Peg. So as many of you know, the Ceres policy team works with a coalition of businesses called BICEP, Businesses for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy. These companies see climate change as a major economic risk and investing in clean technologies as an economic opportunity. We help them bring that message to policymakers federally and across 17 states. Our coalition of almost 70 companies is joined by other businesses that we partner with across the US to help advocate for those meaningful policies, including clean transportation. We also help lead the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance, or CEVA, which is a collaborative group of companies focused on accelerating the transition to electric vehicles, from compact cars to Class 8 heavy-duty trucks. And since its launch in 2020, CEVA has grown to almost 20 members with significant corporate fleets. So next slide here. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, as well as in most states, and has been steadily growing. It's also one of the largest sources of air pollution, creating a significant public health burden that is disproportionately shouldered by low income and communities of color, an issue that both our speakers are going to touch on today. Medium and heavy duty vehicles are a disproportionate driver of those emissions. In fact, heavy duty trucks make up only 5% of vehicles on the road, but they account for more than 25% of overall US transportation emissions. CEVA is growing and companies are investing in electrification as part of their commitment to sustainability, but also because there is a growing business case. Transitioning to EVs already generates cost savings over the life of a vehicle for light duty fleets, as well as for most medium and duty and some heavy duty vehicles. And upfront cost parity is actually just around the corner, something that we would not have said too long ago. So light duty vehicles are expected to have upfront cost parity by 2022. Investing in electrification is a no-brainer when you pair those cost savings with the significant savings from health and avoided climate risk. So there's some recent analysis that found that transitioning to 100% medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles in the US by 2040 would lead to cumulative pollution-related savings of $485 billion by 2050. And that's a real economic boost and also a very real human benefit to avoid all those health impacts you see listed in the chart on the right there. So at the state level, companies have a strong track record of supporting policies that will accelerate the electrification of transportation. From the zero emission vehicle program to EV incentives, deployment of charging infrastructure, governor's orders, state EV adoption goals, to the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic's innovative and ambitious Transportation Climate Initiative, companies and institutions own, operate, and manage a significant portion of the vehicles on the road today. And their employees are responsible for another large portion of vehicles on the road. However, transportation is complicated. There are challenges around EV model availability, upfront costs, range, weight, charging time, charging infrastructure access or installation. So strong policies are needed to coordinate industry leaders and stakeholders to overcome these initial challenges and unlock the savings and benefits of zero-emission vehicles by driving market transformation at a pace and scale that the private sector cannot achieve on its own. The next big frontier is decarbonizing medium and heavy-duty vehicles, and that's where California and New Jersey are really setting the stage. Last year, California moved to adopt the first in the nation advanced clean truck rule. Tony's going to talk a little more about that. And over the last year of that rule's development, we saw a number of companies supporting that rule, and then that number doubled by the time the rule was adopted. Shortly after the adoption of that rule, 15 governors, including those of California and New Jersey, signed on to an MOU committing their states to accelerate the deployment of medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles. Over 50 major companies and institutions have supported that multi-state effort as vitally important to enable cost-effective electrification of commercial vehicles. So as you see, companies are really interested in supporting strong policies in this area. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from Tony and Peg about what's coming up and in what way the companies and investors that we work with can partner with them. So I'll pass over to Tony now. Thanks.
Hello, this is Tony Brazil. I'm the branch chief of the Transportation and Clean Technology branch at the California Air Resources Board. So today I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we're doing here in California and why we need emissions reductions. So the next slide. Today I'm going to give you a quick overview on the need for emissions reductions and what we're doing to electrify here in California. I'll go over some of the regulations that have been adopted or soon to be adopted or being worked on today, and then give you a brief overview of what's going on in the zero emission truck and bus market, since that's a relatively new area that people are less familiar with. Next slide. So you've already heard the summary of this. This is specific to California. Trucks are a very small part of the population of vehicles, but a big impact of both greenhouse gas and NOx emissions that contributes to our smog formation. Next slide. So the zero emission vehicles and strategies are part of what we've determined is the part of the future in California. Stationary ships, trucks and cars need to go zero emission everywhere we can, use the cleanest possible fuels everywhere we cannot electrify. On the next slide, the other area that is a specific area of focus, it's always been, but our Assembly Bill here, 617, does require us to be looking at strategies. They're very focused on communities and the very narrow level of emissions to address the more polluted areas of the state and to get reductions there. And a rapid transition to zero emissions is part of that solution. And then the governor did approve an executive order setting goals for light duty, medium and heavy duty trucks, and off-road equipment to be zero emissions, as described here on the slide. And so next section here, I will move into the zero emission vehicle regulations that we're currently working on or recently adopted. So for light duty vehicle regulations, there's advanced clean cars regulation. It sets a low emission vehicle requirement, identified there in the second bullet, and a zero emission vehicle regulation where about 8% of new sales by 2025 need to be zero emission. And then in the future, there's advanced clean cars too. There's a hearing plan for mid-2022 that would increase the zero emission vehicle sales or light duty cars to 100%. From the 26 through 2035 timeframe, where 2035, 100% sales would need to be zero emission. There's other provisions associated with that. And also currently in development is what's being called the Clean Mile Standard. It's in essence a requirement for ride-hailing services such as Uber and Lyft to use zero emission vehicles for more and more of the passenger miles over time. Now I'm going to shift gears to medium and heavy duty. This graphic here or timeline shows you above the timeline all of the efforts that are already been adopted or are in progress or planned that relate to zero emission vehicles and equipment. On the bottom half are combustion associated emissions. So anything with a check mark has already been approved. And so I'll focus on the two area in the red area there, the advanced clean trucks regulation that was recently adopted and advanced clean fleets, one that we're working on now. And so in summary, the advanced clean trucks regulation approved mid last year has a manufacturer sales component to it. Manufacturers must sell zero emission trucks and buses and vans as part of sales. There's also a reporting requirement for fleets to follow up with another rulemaking that I'll describe in a minute. So next slide. So on this table to the right, you can see what the manufacturer sales requirement are in terms of percentages, and you see that they ramp up over time to being 75% of sales by 2035 for class 4 through 8 straight trucks, and to a lesser degree in the other truck categories. And the Class 2B category is, it starts at like an F250 pickup. And so with this particular schedule, we're anticipating there'll be about 300,000 zero emission medium and heavy duty trucks on the roads by the 2035 timeframe. And so I won't get into the details of the regulation, but there are links to find more information. There's also a requirement for fleets to report, and that's due in April. And we'll use that information for our next rulemaking. So the next slide is simply a graphic showing you that population growth. This is our estimated projection based on typical sales year by year. So the next slide, number 14, the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation is a strategy to then require fleets to purchase zero emission trucks that the manufacturers would be selling. There's three main categories in what we're proposing now. There's one for drayage trucks that serve our ports and rail yards, a high concentration of emissions. And so the goal there is to make a complete transition to zero emission by 2035. Public fleets would also be on the schedule with a straight purchase requirement to start making all purchases zero emission starting in 27. And then there's a third category of high priority private fleets and federal fleets that would meet targets that would be phased in through from 2025 through 2045 to seek a transition for these high priority fleets to all zero emission by the end of 2045 and earlier, depending on the types of trucks that they have. And this is slated to go to our board at the end of this year for a decision. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to the zero emission truck and bus market, and just give you a quick overview just to give you a sense of what's going on in the heavy duty space. The next slide. Generally, the trends are that there's a number of vehicles already available, and there's continued improvements expected in technology. Suppliers and parts manufacturers are introducing commercial components of drivetrains and drive axles that are all for zero emission market. And then in California, we're also trying to coordinate policies to ultimately support electrification. And this next slide is just an image showing you the different types of vehicles that are currently available. We also have incentive programs that I'm not covering that has been encouraging the deployment of these vehicles. One thing that's a little different in California was that we have a low carbon fuel standard that will lower the carbon intensity of our transportation fuels. But how that applies to zero emission vehicles is that if you own your charging station or have a hydrogen station, then you can earn those credits. And today, the credits are actually worth more than the electricity you would buy. So that would, in essence, completely offset your electricity costs. So you can look at this as a zero cost electricity for a fleet here in California, given what market prices are now. On this next slide, this example here shows what those cost savings are. So if you have a smaller van like an airport shuttle, you might save nearly $3,000 a year in fuel with the LCFS program. $8,400 for a package delivery vehicle and nearly $30,000 or potentially more. These are fairly conservative estimates on the market price. We're using $125 per credit, where the actual sales are around $200 per credit. So you could actually be earning more money based on how many miles you're actually traveling. Another thing that's happening here in California is that there's a Senate Bill 350 where the utilities and our sister agency, the Public Utilities Commission, have a program that is approved to put in or support 18,000 trucks and buses with infrastructure. The utilities will pay for, design, and install the upgrades on the property that are necessary to actually charge the vehicle. So this is specific to battery electric. They also have new electricity rates that are more tailored to fleet electrification for commercial customers. And then largely in closing, we'll continue meeting with individuals and stakeholders. We'll continue workshops for most of this year. So there's a couple of categories for infrastructure and cost analysis that we'll be updating. And then we're looking to receive that fleet data, which will help us get better information on how our proposal would affect individual fleets. And then again, our timeline is to have a recommendation to our board in the December timeframe. And so then the last slide I have are some contact and ways to get more information if you're interested in this. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be following Tony from CARB on today's presentation. CARB has truly been an inspiration to me personally, as well as New Jersey DEP. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today are based on CARB's leadership in the area of transportation electrification and a zero carbon future. So for New Jersey specifically, we've released several, I would say, significant or milestone documents over the past year and a half. The first one is our Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report. That's the shorthand. Essentially what that means is we're trying to get an 80% reduction of greenhouse gases below our 2006 baseline by 2050. This 80 by 50 report looked at 7 different emissions sectors, ranging from transportation to building electrification, and evaluated each of those to determine how best to meet our 2050 goal. So to do that, we did business as usual projections and then also evaluated different emission reduction pathways to get us to our 2050 goal. The second and related document down in the right-hand corner is a new initiative just announced last year called New Jersey Pact, Protecting Against Climate Threats. And this is a series of rulemakings that we are undertaking to address both climate mitigation and climate resiliency. On the climate mitigation front, we are following CARB's lead and looking to adopt the advanced clean truck rule that Tony talked about, as well as the low NOx omnibus rule, and then a cargo handling equipment fleet modernization rule to try to get short-term reductions in some of the EJ areas that are most impacted by goods movement at our ports. And then the middle document really is applicable to everything that we do. So the middle document is called Furthering the Promise. And this is a framework for incorporating equity and environmental justice considerations into everything that we do, not just at DEP, but also working with our sister agencies in New Jersey to help them figure out how to do the same, how to incorporate equity and environmental justice in their day-to-day operations and responsibilities. On the next slide. I think we all know the reason that we're talking about this today is because New Jersey, like many other states, have significant emissions from the transportation sector when we're looking at greenhouse gases. But in addition to that, it's also always important to remember, and I keep reminding myself of this, that the transportation sector not only emits greenhouse gases, but also emits particulates, NOx, and air toxics, many of which are particularly impactful in the urban and EJ areas. So we're really getting at a lot of different pollutants when we tackle the transportation sector. Next slide. The 80 by 50 report primarily focuses on the transportation sector. You can see that's the biggest circle here because it is such a big share of our statewide emissions. But it also tells us that we really need to look at buildings as well. And it sets a goal of electrifying 90% of our buildings by 2050. And then going along with that, the windmill slide there, our governor has set a goal of 100% carbon neutral electricity generation by 2050. And that is critically important when we're talking about transportation electrification. We're talking about increasing the impacts on the grid, drawing more energy from the grid when we electrify all of those vehicles. And we want to make sure that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. So we really need that electricity that we're pulling to be clean. And that's why we have a 100% clean energy goal by 2050 to operate in parallel with our transportation electrification goals. Next slide. So I always think it's helpful to look at graphics when we're talking about numbers. A lot of the goals that we bandy about are in terms of percent sales. And I like to convert those to actual number of vehicles on the road. So right now in New Jersey, we have a little over 6 million registered passenger vehicles in the state. And you can see different trajectories and different goals here. But let's look at the 80 by 50 report that I just mentioned. So the goal in the 80 by 50 report is for 85% of our sales to be electric by 2030 and then 100% by 2035. And you can see where that leaves us. That's about almost 3 million electric vehicles on the road by 2035 out of a total population of 6.5 is the actual number. So an enormously steep trajectory, a very aggressive goal. And then on this next slide, we'll take a moment to look at our medium and heavy duty electrification goals. So the medium and heavy duty truck sector in New Jersey, the population is much smaller than our passenger vehicle population. So we have about somewhere between 500 and 600,000 medium and heavy duty trucks, buses, things like that on the road in New Jersey. We have two goals that we're working with here, and those are the middle two lines there, the bright green and the olive green. So one of those lines reflects the advanced clean truck rule, which Tony talked about and which New Jersey is looking to adopt. And then the line that's almost on top of that is a goal that was set as the result of our governor and 14 others signing a regional commitment under NESCOM's leadership to get 100% EVs on the 100% EV sales by 2050. And you can see that those two goals line up really nicely, but just like we saw on the light duty slide, it is a very, very steep trajectory. So by 2035, we're talking about going from maybe 10 electric medium and heavy duty trucks on the road today to 100,000. So you can do the math there and see how bold of a goal this is, bold goals these are. Next slide. So thinking about what we need to do to get to those goals, we need to do more than just adopt and forget. So adopting a regulation, whether it's the advanced clean truck rule or the zero emission vehicle rule that we adopted probably 10 or 12 years ago now, is not going to get us where we want to go. So one of the things we're doing is trying to identify various funding sources that we can use to jumpstart the market and incentivize different applications for electric vehicles. These are some examples here. So our RGGI strategic funding plan focuses almost entirely on transportation electrification. And our first year's auction proceeds brought in about $95 million. So we're going to be dedicating almost all of that to transportation electrification. Similarly, we've used the Volkswagen settlement and some other enforcement actions to leverage kind of giving a shot in the arm to the truck electrification sector. Next slide. This is the regional commitment that I mentioned. So 14 states and jurisdictions spread throughout the East Coast, West Coast, and then Colorado in the middle there and Hawaii, all committing to work together to move the market and to send a signal to the market that we all really want to make this happen. And, you know, that cliche where there's power in numbers is really going to come true here, I think. So this is a great collaborative effort. Next slide. And I just wanted to end by emphasizing what I had said on the first slide. So our furthering the promise commitment to equity really needs to carry over to transportation equity as well. And we need to make sure that as we electrify the transportation sector, we're very mindful of the differences in the EJ areas. Specifically, the data is showing that most residents of EJ areas do not own a car. And if they do, it's not going to be electric. So we really need to curate a different approach for those EJ communities. We can't just pile on incentives and try to encourage them to buy an electric vehicle. Instead, we need to bring to them electric ride sharing, electric ride hailing, electric transit buses, and electric school buses. So we need to make sure that they have those clean mobility options in their community as we move forward with this overall goal of zero carbon transportation by 2050.
So thank you both for this presentation. It has been so inspiring to see the progress that states in general, but New Jersey and California in particular, have been able to make these last several years on clean transportation. I know time is short for the session, so without further ado, I want to dive right into a discussion. You've each been part of numerous rulemakings, some of which you were touching on in your presentations. There's a lot of interested parties when you guys are developing these rules: public and private fleet owners, utilities, communities overburdened by pollution, traditional environmental groups, to name just a few. So how do you guys think about stakeholder outreach when you begin these processes? Are there best practices to ensure that opportunities and concerns are being surfaced from a broad range of perspectives? And Tony, would you mind starting?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. Well, to a degree, we have an advantage in that we have been regulating the transportation industry for quite some time. So we have some pretty broad mailing lists. So every time we start a new rulemaking, we try to let everybody know who might be affected by it, stakeholders that obviously own vehicles, but also the community. One of the things we try to do too is have day and evening meetings, for instance, to improve access. And obviously with the remote situation currently, we're doing a lot of that by video, but we try to do things like that and have recordings so people can catch up later.
And when you were developing the Advanced Clean Fleets rule in particular, I'm thinking about, was there any specific feedback from companies that helped shape that rule? What are you looking for from our audience members who are mostly company representatives right now?
Yeah, well, broadly, I'll actually go back a little bit to answer that question. When we started looking at just the medium and heavy duty space, we were originally looking at fleet type rules because we've done those in the past. But what came to be was a lot of the companies came forward and said, look, we've been trying to electrify for 5 to 10 years, and we can't do it because the manufacturers aren't serving the market. So we actually changed the approach to first do the manufacturer requirement to ensure that the sales would be there, to then go after the fleet strategy, to then make sure that the fleets are placing them in service and getting benefits in those localized communities where we need it the most.
That's an interesting point, then, and I do want to follow up on that. But first, Peg, what's your perspective on this? And one thing too, I'd be curious your take on. Our companies have a broad range of capacity and experience in this, right? So some are able to get into the details of, fine-grained rulemaking, but others just want to be able to offer high-level and directional support. Is that still helpful for what you're doing? Are there particular ways of providing the different types of feedback that could make the comments more or less useful?
So I guess I'd like to hit that from two angles. So first, yeah, absolutely. I think any kind of input from the affected, the regulated entities is absolutely helpful. I think with the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, one of the things we need to start thinking about right now and doing engagement on is the users of those vehicles. We know that the zero emission fleet rule is coming up and there will be purchase requirements. So I think engaging that part of the regulated community now is a really good idea. And I also don't want to forget about the EJ communities, which I mentioned in my presentation. We have to make sure that they're at the table early and often and in a meaningful way. We don't often think of them as the regulated entities, but they have a vested interest in where these trucks are deployed. So to the extent that we can prioritize the deployment of the clean trucks or incentivize the deployment of the clean trucks in their neighborhoods, that's going to be really important for them.
I'm really glad you brought that up. That actually leads directly into my next question, is because the geographic distribution of emissions reduction is so important for all transportation policies, but especially as we begin to focus on medium and heavy duty vehicles that are disproportionately responsible for the co-pollutants that affect public health. How are we ensuring that the communities that have been most overburdened get the benefits of these programs first? I know in Massachusetts, there's a EV purchase incentive program that's offering an adder for vehicles that operate in certain designated zip codes. New Jersey, you have both the advantage and disadvantage of a lot of concentration around ports. So you could focus policies on those facilities, but what other ways are your states trying to focus on these geographic targeted areas? And are there new ideas you haven't implemented yet, but you're exploring? Peg, why don't you start?
Sure. So about 2 weeks ago, we announced $100 million of Volkswagen and Reggie proceeds to go towards transportation electrification. All of that money will go towards EJ communities. So trying to incentivize and jumpstart compliance with the Advanced Clean Truck Rule by getting the experience on the ground in those EJ communities and bringing the benefits to those communities first. We're also looking forward to the zero emission fleet rule to the extent that it prioritizes things like drayage trucks. I think that's a great way to go.
Thanks. Tony?
Yeah, to add to that, you kind of covered a lot of the bases. Number of our funding programs do have an adder for vehicles that are going to be operated in a disadvantaged community, for instance. Strategy-wise, in terms of the regulatory concept, it's all drayage trucks would be converted to zero emission by 2035, which is a fairly short time frame. But the other types of trucks, like package delivery and box trucks and vans, also would be on a schedule that will ultimately get to 2035 complete transition. And so that'll get those benefits in those local communities, neighborhoods, and things like that. Even something as simple as yard tractors, making sure that those go zero emission now or sooner rather than later is another way to get benefits around warehouses for the vehicles that stay there on those properties, for example. So we are looking at those, and one of the things that we are exploring are other ways for companies to preferentially hire those zero emission fleets and see if there's a recognition type program that might be beneficial and useful to further the same end.
Thanks. And, you know, I have a half a dozen more questions, but I don't think we're going to have time to get to any of them. So I just want to say thank you both for engaging on this discussion today, but also the work you're doing day to day to keep your states out on the forefront of this. You know, New Jersey and California are two of the most ambitious states on transportation policy in the country, but they're not alone. Legislatures in at least 3 states have considered adopting the Advanced Clean Cars rule this year. With New Jersey as the first, we hope many more are going to be looking at the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. 15 states so far are taking part in a multi-state working group to develop an action plan for zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles. And all of these efforts are going to benefit from robust corporate engagement. You know, in some states, that means high level support for legislation. In others, it's feedback for administrative rulemaking. And as always, the Ceres policy team is going to be tracking these opportunities and presenting them to our members. So whatever your appetite for policy details, our team can work to tailor these opportunities for you. Because whether it's fine grain regulation or high level support, you know, the corporate backing for these efforts is essential to ensuring the transition to a cleaner transportation system happens as smoothly and as rapidly as the moment demands. So thank you for joining us today, and please be in touch with any thoughts today's discussion has sparked.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.